Hey there, in this tutorial we'll be talking about separation. This is an important concept you need to understand in order to mix your work well. In our previous tutorial about the mixing checklist, you heard me mention many of the terms we use to separate our instruments. I'd like to take a minute to talk about these, and that's because they're really important to understand so you don't go into your mixing process blindfolded. In a good mix, you can hear the individual instruments. They have good presence, they sound clean. In a poor mix, the instruments blur and there may be noise and distortion. That's because the poor mix isn't properly separated. Let's divide the separation of sound into the three dimensions that I mentioned earlier: dynamics, frequency content, and panning. Probably the easiest aspect of separation to understand is the panning. In a mono recording, all the instruments are bunched together in the middle. Stereo positioning has been around a long time now, and surround sound is pretty common too. For stereo positioning, you want each instrument to have a unique place from left to right, as if you're physically spreading them across the space. For surround sound, it's three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional. You mix 3D and in 360 degrees. There's a number of panning conventions. For example, vocals usually come out in the center or just off a center. Guitars sound better in stereo with a dry signal on one side and a wet signal on the other. Rhythm instruments, like piano, are also panned in stereo and off to the side. Same thing with the strings. Most of the drum kit except the kick and snare are panned to one side or the other. We'll be taking up this in more detail later in this section. Sometimes the instrument levels fluctuate up and down so that the sound disappears behind another instrument. Then it reappears and overwhelms other instruments. This means you need better control over the dynamics to even out the levels. Each instrument needs its place in the mix. And to start, you need to control the levels. You can drag your faders up and down to bring some evenness to the volume, but it's actually better to apply some compression to a dynamically uneven track. We're going to learn how to do this later on in this section. Now let's talk about frequency content. If an instrument's too hot in your mix, you can cut off some of its highs and upper mids. These are the frequencies that make an instrument sound more upfront. Similarly, if you want it to sound more present, you need to raise some of these frequencies. If you can't hear some important parts or they don't sound clear, they might need a boost. Don't pile on the highs on every instrument or your mix will be fatiguing, and you lose some of the separation you achieved by bringing up a certain part. I've just mentioned the highs here, but balancing out your tones through the whole frequency spectrum is really important. Each instrument needs a slot or a niche in the frequency spectrum so that the instruments don't conflict with one another. In fact, it's a good idea to map out your frequency slots before you record a piece. This makes the mixing much easier later on. Each instrument needs a distinctive tone color. Put some thought into your song's arrangement before you start recording. This helps you, for example, separate instruments in other ways that you can't do during the mixing. For example, you can have your organ play the downbeats while your guitar does the upbeats. This can help you avoid situations where instruments have clashing dramatic moments too. Let's say you've got the emotional peak of your vocal. This isn't the time for other instruments to be playing busy phrases in the frequencies of the vocalist's voice. This concludes our tutorial about separation.